Hi, I'm the son who never got a seat at the table, unless it was to be humiliated. My father called me useless for playing piano, said it had no value. Then, at our last Father's Day dinner, he raised his glass to my brother, looked right past me, and said, "I'm proud of all my children, except that failure." Everyone laughed. My mother looked down, and I placed the DNA test results on the table and said, "Happy Father's Day." What happened next? It didn't just silence the room. It destroyed everything they thought was true. But here's the thing. The collapse wasn't the hardest part. It was living all those years believing I was the broken one. So, would you stay for a few minutes? Let me show you what really broke him. I pulled into my parents' driveway just as the sun was slipping behind the maples lining the street. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, trimmed hedges, the porch light already on, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. Father's Day dinners in my family were less about celebration and more about tradition. You showed up. You sat where you were told. You smiled when it was expected. Inside, the smell of roasted meat and buttered vegetables filled the hallway. The dining room table was already set, heavy plates laid out with careful symmetry. Candles stood in the center, unlit but decorative, like props waiting for their cue. Everyone else had arrived before me. They usually did. My older brother sat at the head of the table, close enough to my father that their shoulders nearly aligned. He was mid-story, talking about work, numbers, projects, something impressive enough to keep everyone leaning in. My father listened with an expression I'd seen my entire life: approval, interest, volume in his voice that never appeared when he spoke to me. I took my usual seat near the far end of the table, not assigned officially, just where I always ended up, close enough to be counted, far enough to be ignored. My mother moved quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, placing serving bowls down with care. When she passed me, she gave a small nod, her eyes already drifting away. She rarely stayed in one place long during meals like this. It was easier not to be noticed. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked about my drive, my week, or what I'd been working on. That wasn't unusual. I learned a long time ago that questions were a kind of currency in this family, and I didn't earn many. Someone, one of my cousins I think, mentioned in passing that I was still playing piano. It wasn't said with interest, more like trivia. Something you'd say about an old hobby you never expected to lead anywhere. My father didn't even look at me when he responded. "That thing has no value," he said dismissively, as if brushing dust from a shelf. The room went still for half a second, just long enough for the words to land. Then conversation resumed, lighter than before, as though nothing had happened. I kept my hands folded in my lap and focused on the pattern in the tablecloth. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I'd learned the cost of that. Dinner was served. Plates were passed. Laughter rose and fell in predictable waves. My brother spoke again, louder now, confident. My father laughed with him, the sound full and unguarded. Halfway through the meal, my father stood and lifted his glass. "Father's Day," he said, smiling at the room. "It gives you a chance to reflect on what you've built." He went on about sacrifice, responsibility, doing things that mattered. He praised my brother by name. His voice softened when he spoke about legacy. Then he paused, just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. "I'm proud of all my children," he said, eyes scanning the table. "Except that failure." Laughter followed. Not cruel, not kind, just easy, familiar. My mother looked down at her plate. No one said a word. I stayed seated. I didn't push back from the table. I didn't leave. I didn't defend myself. Silence had kept the peace before, even when it cost me something each time I used it. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a plain envelope. White, unmarked. I set it beside my plate without ceremony. No one noticed. They were still talking, still laughing. I looked up at my father and met his eyes. This dinner was never about Father's Day. It was about who belonged and who never did. I didn't come to that table to argue. I came because I finally knew the truth. Kept my eyes on the candlelight flickering in the center of the table. The wax had barely melted, though dinner was halfway through. People kept eating. The clink of silverware picked up again like nothing had happened. A cousin leaned over to pour more wine. Someone laughed at a joke I didn't catch. That was the thing about humiliation in my family. It passed fast if you weren't the one bleeding from it. Everyone else just moved on. That night, I sat still, too still, because leaving would have confirmed his words. That failure. If I stood up, if I walked out, that would be my role sealed. I knew the game. You don't make it easier for them. You sit. You chew. You pretend you didn't just get gutted in front of a table of people who once called you baby brother. My body stayed. My mind stepped out. It was like watching the room through a thin sheet of glass. Sound muffled. Movements dulled. I heard forks tapping plates, but they sounded distant. I caught someone calling my name. I didn't respond. My gaze drifted, not out the window, but to the corner of the house, just beyond the archway that led to the front hall. There it was. The old, upright piano, still tucked between the coat rack and the window, just like when I was 10. The varnish had faded. One of the legs still leaned slightly to the left, thanks to a rough move during a winter storm. But it was still there, and for a second I wasn't 35 anymore. I was 8, feet dangling off the bench, trying to stretch my fingers across an octave. I remembered my first recital. I played a simple piece, nothing brilliant, but I did it without mistakes. Afterward, Dad patted me on the shoulder and said, "Nice hobby, but make sure you learn something useful too." He didn't mean it cruelly. That was the part that stung worse. He genuinely thought he was being helpful. That same weekend, my brother came home from school with a math trophy. Dad pulled out the camcorder, made us all stand in the living room while he had Matt hold the plaque and talk about his process. He showed that tape to everyone for years. I don't think he ever watched one of mine. The piano never made me popular. It didn't win competitions, but it gave me peace. That didn't count here. Around this table, things only mattered if you could wear them like armor, grades, promotions, titles. The piano was a soft thing, and soft things didn't survive long under my father's kind of love. It wasn't hate. That would have been simpler. It was conditional warmth. You earned it. If your name came with applause, he'd show up. If it didn't, you learned to stop expecting him in the crowd. I used to wonder if it was just me, if I was too quiet, if I didn't push hard enough. But the older I got, the clearer it became. Love in this house had requirements. Be useful, be admired, be impressive. So I adapted. I played the role that worked. I didn't fight. I didn't ask for much. I smiled at birthdays, brought safe gifts, stayed out of the spotlight. I kept the peace. Everyone likes the one who doesn't cause trouble, even if it breaks them inside. That role kept everyone comfortable, except me. A glass clinked again, pulling me back to the present. The envelope was still on the table, quiet as ever. My name wasn't on it. No markings, Just white paper folded over the kind of truth that couldn't be unspoken once said. I'd held on to it for weeks, carried it in my coat pocket every time I saw them, unsure if I'd ever actually hand it over. I nearly left it at home tonight, thought maybe it wasn't the right moment. But when he raised that glass, when he said those words again, right in front of everyone, I knew there was never going to be a perfect moment. Only this one. My hand rested on the edge of the envelope. I didn't move it. Not yet. Because once the truth is on the table, nothing stays the same. Not even silence. And silence doesn't protect peace anymore. It only protects a lie. I didn't bring the truth to hurt anyone. I brought it because pretending was finally hurting me more. By the time the laughter died down and someone passed the breadbasket again, I'd gone quiet, not just in voice, but in presence. I moved my fork just enough to keep from standing out, sipped water when someone looked my way, but inside, I wasn't at that table anymore. The envelope sat untouched beside my plate. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside, what it said, what it meant, and why it had taken me so long to ask the question in the first place. The doubt didn't begin tonight. It had been a low hum under everything for years, maybe decades. It wasn't one single moment. It was a string of them, scattered across birthdays, Christmas mornings, Sunday mornings when we all used to squeeze into the pew. The comments were always small, easy to overlook, easier to dismiss. You're not like me. I don't know where you got that from. Are you sure you're mine? They were said with a chuckle, a wink. The kind of teasing fathers get away with because no one stops to ask what they're really saying. For years, I didn't ask either, but I never forgot the tone behind those words. Something between amusement and distance. A shrug that didn't land like a joke. At first, I blamed it on the piano. On the way, I always looked for the quiet corners, how I felt more at home in music than in crowds. Maybe I wasn't what he expected in a son. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe that was enough to make me feel like I'd been born into the wrong house without ever packing a bag. But little things stuck with me. My hair was darker than anyone else's. My build didn't match his or my brother's. My nose. My mother's maybe, but nothing else. Family photos showed a line of square jaws and broad shoulders, until mine. I didn't look adopted. I looked slightly out of place. Just enough to wonder, never enough to ask. And then there were the stories that didn't add up. A missing timeline here, a half answer there. I always told myself I was reading too much into it, that families forget details all the time. That memory's slippery when grief or pride gets involved. But the older I got, the harder it was to ignore the way people stumbled over my birth year, the way my dad never talked about the day I was born, the way my mom smiled too long when someone asked if I looked like her. The question formed years ago, not in anger, never in anger. It came like fog creeping up a window, slow and hard to see clearly at first. But once it was there, I couldn't unsee it. I remember the exact moment it sharpened. I was sitting in the garage, going through old boxes while helping Mom clean out storage. She was inside on a phone call. I found a stack of photos, me as a baby, but none of them had Dad in them. No hospital pictures, no wristbands, no cards, just shots of me on my mother's lap, alone. And taped inside one of the photo albums was a card, yellowed and fragile. Congratulations, Margaret. Beautiful boy. R. No last name. No family stamp. Just R. I didn't ask her about it. I closed the album and put it back. And I haven't touched that box since. I couldn't ask her. She carried a silence that was thicker than mine. one she wore like a second skin. She always looked like she was holding her breath when the family gathered, like she was walking through rooms carefully, afraid of what she might knock loose. I didn't want to add weight to the load she already bore, so I did what I always did. I stayed quiet. Until a few months ago, something snapped, not loudly, just enough to make me order the test. Online, private, no fanfare, just a deep breath and a credit card. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friend. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want, "Are you sure?" or "What if it's nothing?" It wasn't about drama. It was about survival, about finally seeing the shape of the thing I'd been avoiding since I was a kid. The kid arrived. I did what it asked, mailed it back, and then I waited. That week was brutal. I barely slept. I kept the tracking number saved on my phone and checked it twice a day. Part of me prayed it would take longer. I wasn't ready. Not really. I was scared. Scared of being right. Terrified of what that would mean. That everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, might crack open. When the email came, I stared at it for hours. Didn't open it until after midnight. I sat alone in my apartment, blinds drawn, the piano untouched. I hovered over the link like it was a detonator, and for a long moment I wanted to delete it, pretend I never saw it, live in the fog. The truth wasn't going to change the past, and if I opened it, I couldn't ever unknow it. But I did open it, and it gave me an answer. I'm not ready to say what it said. Not yet. But I'll say this. It wasn't vague. It didn't leave room for doubt. The results were specific, confirmed, final. By the time I walked into that Father's Day dinner, I already knew something that could never be taken back. I carried that truth in with me like a stone in my chest, invisible but heavy. The smell of ham and rosemary hadn't changed. The lighting above the table was still too bright, and the same worn-out conversation about property taxes was circling again. But for me, everything had tilted. Suddenly, every voice felt louder. Forks tapping against plates, glasses clinking, each sound sharper, more distinct, like the volume of the room had gone up while I was gone. My father laughed at something my brother said. It echoed in a way it hadn't before. That laugh. It didn't sound like mine. It never had. And when his eyes landed on me, just for a second, they didn't rest. They bounced off like I was just another face in the room. I didn't need confirmation anymore. I had it. But now I had something else. A question about what I was going to do with it. He leaned back, one arm stretched along the chair beside him, like a man who'd never been questioned a day in his life. "You know what the problem is today?" he announced, almost cheerful. "Too many people chasing dreams that don't pay the bills, playing around with art, music, feelings." He glanced at me, just long enough to make the point. What happened to good, honest work? A few family members chuckled. My uncle nodded as if that statement carried some profound truth. But I didn't flinch this time. I didn't shrink. I didn't even get angry. I just saw it for what it was. Fear. Fear wrapped in authority. The louder he got, the more I could hear it. He needed to believe his version of strength was the only one that mattered. And then came the parade. "You know," he went on, turning toward my brother, "this one here? He stuck with it. Practical, reliable, built something from nothing. Didn't waste time trying to express himself. He understood what it meant to be a man." My brother shifted in his seat. His fork paused midway to his mouth. He didn't look at me. He didn't defend me. But he didn't join in either. That was the moment I saw him clearly, not as my rival, but as a participant in a system that had always needed someone beneath it. He didn't invent the rules. He just never questioned them. And that was easier when I stayed in my place. Across the table, my mother sat still. Too still. Her hands were folded tight in her lap, knuckles white. Her jaw moved slightly, like she was chewing, but her plate was untouched. She knew. I'd always suspected. But now it was confirmed, not by words, but by everything she didn't say. She hadn't looked at me since the toast, not directly, but when my father raised his glass again, making another half joke that wasn't a joke, she blinked slowly, like someone who wanted to disappear. And for a second, I wanted to let her. I wanted to push back my chair, take that envelope with me, walk out the door, and let the story end right there. I imagined it, sliding behind the wheel, the night air cool through the window, the house shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. I could pretend none of this mattered. I'd done it before, but pretending had cost me more than the truth ever could. If I left, it would be the same as saying they were right about me, that I wasn't worth staying for, that silence equaled weakness, and that my story ended in someone else's voice, not mine. I breathed in slow. No one noticed. The wine was being poured again. My cousin asked about someone's new car. Quietly, I picked up the envelope and shifted it, just a few inches, closer to the center of the table, still beside my plate, but no longer tucked away. It caught the corner of the overhead light. No one saw it. Not yet. But it was there now. Undeniable. I wasn't rushing anything. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just wanted it to be present. Like me. And I watched my father, still talking, still grinning, and realized something else. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I wasn't planning to speak, but my father made sure I wouldn't be able to stay silent much longer. The moment stretched after that thought settled in my mind. I could feel it. Something in the air had shifted, even if no one else noticed yet. My father cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like he was about to deliver another harmless observation. That was always how it started. Harmless. He glanced at me, then at the rest of the table, a smile already forming. "You know," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "some people are just born dreamers, always chasing something that doesn't pay rent." He let out a short laugh. "Guess not everyone can handle real responsibility." The laughter came again, quick, automatic, a reflex. Someone slapped the table lightly, as if it were all good fun. Another voice added, "Hey, somebody's got to keep the piano stores in business, right?" More laughter. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt the most. It was the ease of it. The way the joke landed exactly where it always did. Familiar. Practiced. This wasn't cruelty that slipped out by mistake. This was habit. A performance he'd perfected over years, knowing the room would back him up. Then the laughter faded. Not completely. Just enough. And suddenly, all eyes were on me. I felt it like pressure against my skin. Faces turned, forks paused, conversations stopped mid-sentence. They were waiting, not for an answer, for permission, for me to smile, shrug, maybe even join in. That was the rule. Laugh it off, and dinner continues. Don't, and you become the problem. I sat there, shoulders relaxed, hands steady on my lap. My chest felt tight, but my breathing stayed slow. I'd spent a lifetime learning how to hold myself together in moments like this. How to look calm while everything inside was screaming. This was the moment. The one that had replayed itself in different forms my entire life. School events, holidays, even casual visits. The same test over and over again. Stay quiet or break the pattern. I noticed small things I'd never allowed myself to notice before. The way my fingers pressed slightly into my thigh, the warmth rising behind my ears, the strange clarity that came with it. This wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. If I stayed silent now, I always would. I looked across the table at my mother, just for a second. She met my eyes and then looked away, her lips pressed together. She didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. That silence hit harder than the joke ever could. I understood then, fully, that no one was going to step in. No one was going to rescue this moment for me. Whatever happened next was on me alone. And oddly, that realization brought a kind of calm with it. I didn't stand up. I didn't push my chair back. I didn't defend myself. Not yet. I stayed seated. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Staying meant I wasn't retreating. I wasn't shrinking. I was claiming space in a room that had spent years trying to make me feel temporary. The envelope sat there, no longer hidden by the edge of my plate. The light caught it again, and this time someone noticed. My aunt squinted slightly. "What's that?" she asked casually, like she was pointing out a misplaced napkin. I felt every muscle in my body respond, but my voice stayed even. "Just something I brought with me," I said. "For Father's Day?" someone else asked. "Something like that," I replied. My father glanced down at it, then back at me. His smile tightened. "You always were dramatic," he said. "What is it? A song? A poem?" A few people chuckled, uncertain this time. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had inched closer without anyone noticing. Conversations didn't restart. Plates sat untouched. Even my brother finally looked at me, concern flickering across his face before he quickly looked away again. That was when I knew there was no going back to how things were. Whether I spoke or not, the balance had already tipped. The joke had failed to land the way it usually did. The silence afterward had changed its meaning. This dinner had reached its edge. The truth wasn't knocking anymore. It was sitting right there, between the salt and pepper, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached for the envelope. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached for the envelope. And just like that, the room fell completely silent. No clink of fork on porcelain, no refill requests, no idle chatter about sports or whether the roast was dry this year. Just stillness, dense, almost physical. It was the kind of quiet you could lean into and feel it lean right back, pressing gently on your ribs, warning you not to move too fast. Funny how silence weighs more than shouting ever could. I didn't say a word, didn't clear my throat or set the scene. I just placed the envelope at the center of the table, slowly, deliberately, between the butter dish and a half-finished bowl of coleslaw. It didn't make a sound when it landed, but somehow it was louder than anything that had come before it. I sat back in my chair, not slouched, not defiant, just steady. I didn't owe anyone a speech, not tonight. My father was the first to react, of course he was. He leaned forward, his expression somewhere between annoyance and disbelief. "What's this now?" he asked, voice carrying a forced amusement. "A letter of resignation? Or maybe a bill for all that piano practice?" A weak chuckle came from the far end of the table, but it died quickly. It didn't catch like before. Even the room seemed tired of the routine. He looked around, waiting for backup, but none came. He added, "You're always pulling stunts, son. Always need a stage." Still, I said nothing. That was when Aunt Lynn, sitting to my left, reached out. Her hand hovered a moment, as if asking permission without words. Then she gently slid the flap open and pulled the papers out, 3 sheets, crisp, folded neatly. The header on the top page caught the light just enough to make it unmistakable. She didn't read aloud. She didn't need to. The entire table leaned in, not their bodies necessarily, but their attention. Every single person at that table was suddenly alert, breathing slower, blinking less. Their eyes bounced between me, the document, and my father. He squinted, and then his face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it might in a movie. No sudden gasp or spilled drink, just a subtle shift. His jaw tightened, his eyebrows knit together ever so slightly. His hand, still resting next to his glass, curled inward just a bit. He recognized the form, his mouth open like he had something to say, but no words came out. I waited for a beat, then another, and when it was clear no one else would, I finally spoke. "It's a paternity test," I said, voice low, calm. "That's all." I didn't look at him when I said it. I didn't need to. The effect was immediate. Chairs shifted. Someone inhaled sharply. Across from me, my cousin David murmured, "Jesus," under his breath. But mostly, there was silence, again. Only now it wasn't uncertain. It was shocked. My brother, seated diagonally across from me, stared at the document, then at me, then at our father. His lips parted, but he said nothing. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, memories rearranging themselves in real time, trying to make sense of something that suddenly no longer added up. My mother didn't move at all. She sat very still, her fingers laced tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. Her face was expressionless, but not blank. There was something behind her eyes, grief, maybe, or relief. It was hard to tell. But whatever it wasn't surprise, not entirely. The room didn't erupt. No one yelled. No one even demanded answers. Instead, everything slowed. It felt like the moment before a storm, when the air gets thick and everything living holds its breath. And I realized, as I looked around that table, that I didn't have to explain anything. Not tonight. The truth had entered the room. It was sitting there now, plain as daylight. And it was doing what years of arguments and begging and trying to belong never could. It was unraveling something no one had ever thought could be touched. My father, he was still upright in his seat, still wearing the same shirt, still with the same voice box and title and posture he always had. But something in him had already collapsed, and everybody knew it. He wasn't the man who held the room anymore. And I didn't need to hold anything back. The envelope wasn't the beginning. It was the end of pretending. My father was still standing, but the certainty he'd lived on was already gone. It didn't last long. His face hardened, the color rising in his neck, as if his body was trying to catch up with what his mind refused to accept. He pushed his chair back just enough to make it scrape the floor, a sharp sound that cut through the silence. "This is nonsense," he snapped, voice suddenly louder than it had been all evening. "Absolute nonsense." He pointed at the papers on the table without touching them, like they might contaminate him. "You think you can walk in here and drop something like that on a holiday and expect us to take it seriously?" His tone wasn't confusion, it was offense, as if I'd violated some rule by speaking a truth that didn't ask his permission. "You always did have a flair for drama," he went on, pacing a step behind his chair now. digging up garbage, twisting facts. God knows where you even got this thing done. He shook his head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Anyone can fake paperwork these days. I didn't respond. That seemed to irritate him more. He turned toward the rest of the table, spreading his hands. After everything I've done for this family, everything I've provided, this is how I get repaid? His voice wavered just slightly, then steadied again. Being ambushed, disrespected, on Father's Day. There it was, the rewrite. Suddenly, he wasn't the man who'd spent decades deciding who mattered. He was the victim, the wounded patriarch attacked by an ungrateful child who couldn't handle his own failures. It was a story he knew well, one he'd used before. You all know me, he said, looking from face to face. You know what kind of man I am. You know what I've sacrificed. His eyes landed on my brother. Tell them this is ridiculous. My brother stiffened. He cleared his throat, glanced at me, then back at our father. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. I don't know, he said finally. I mean, I don't know enough to say either way. It wasn't support, but it wasn't an attack, and that was new. My father's jaw tightened. He turned toward my mother. You're not going to say anything? She flinched at the sound of his voice. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought them together on the table, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles went pale. She took a breath, lips parting as if words were lining up behind them. She began. Then she stopped. Her eyes dropped to the table, to the papers she hadn't looked at once since they appeared. Whatever she was about to say stayed trapped somewhere deep inside her chest. Fear, maybe, or habit, or something heavier than both. That silence landed hard. I realized then that this truth didn't just threaten reputations. It threatened structures, lives built carefully around something fragile and unspoken. This wasn't just about who my father was to me. It was about who he'd been allowed to be to everyone. His voice rose again, sharper now. You don't understand what you're doing, he said, pointing at me. You think this ends here? You think there won't be consequences? He leaned forward, eyes locked on mine. You bring this kind of filth into my house. You don't get to call yourself part of this family. You hear me? No inheritance. No support. No more pretending you belong. There it was. The threat. Stripped of humor. Stripped of ceremony. Underneath the anger, I could finally see it. Fear. Raw and unguarded. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. Of being seen differently. Of having the story rewritten without his consent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend the test or explain the process or list statistics. None of that mattered right now. I simply rested my hand on the edge of the table, close to the papers, anchoring myself there. I'm not debating it, I said quietly. And I'm not asking anyone to choose sides. That was all. No accusations, no raised voice, no attempt to win the room. The effect was immediate. His next words came slower, less certain. He opened his mouth, then paused, as if realizing that intimidation wasn't landing the way it used to. The room wasn't bending with him anymore. No one spoke. No one moved to gather the papers or smooth things over. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until it became clear that something fundamental had cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically, but deeply. I watched my father in that moment, truly watched him, and understood something I'd never allowed myself to see before. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of being exposed, and once that fear surfaced, there was no way to force it back down. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of being exposed. That realization settled into the room like smoke, visible only if you were really looking, but thick enough to shift how the air moved. The man who'd once commanded every space he entered now stood in silence, shoulders heavy, eyes darting from one face to the next, unsure of who still believed in the version of him he always sold. For a moment, no one said a word. Then, like a slow leak, his fury drained. His hands, which had been clenched on the back of his chair, loosened their grip. He looked down at the open report again, his eyes scanning it not with disbelief this time, but with desperation. His lips moved as he read some of the lines silently to himself, as though the act of rereading might uncover a loophole, a typo, a technicality that would restore his world. "What is this supposed to prove?" he muttered, voice barely audible now, no longer booming. "These people don't know anything about this family. They don't know me." His words lacked structure. They tripped over themselves, no longer forming the clean narratives he used to control a room. He flipped the pages back and forth as if searching for a version that didn't exist. And the room, it wasn't watching me anymore. All attention had shifted to him. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like gravity changed direction. I wasn't the threat now. I wasn't even the center. He was. Even my brother, who had spent a lifetime absorbing our father's expectations like sunlight, couldn't meet his gaze. He stared at the table instead, jaw tight, knuckles white against the edge of his glass. Across from me, my mother sat perfectly still until her eyes began to follow him. They didn't hold anger, not defense either. They held something closer to grief. And that's when I noticed the smallest tremor in his hands. Then his breath shifted. It was subtle at first, just a sharp inhale through his nose, then another, shorter, shallower. His chest began to rise and fall with more effort, not like a man out of breath, but like someone trying to keep from unraveling. "Dad," my brother said quietly, "you okay?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head like the question was too large to fit inside him. His eyes seemed to go soft around the edges, like someone realizing they'd wandered into a place they no longer recognized. "Dad," my brother repeated, rising slightly from his chair. Still nothing. Then, finally, my mother spoke. "I knew," she said. Her voice was low, almost conversational, the way someone might speak when admitting they forgot to turn off the stove. "I didn't know all of it. Not like this. But I knew enough. Enough to be afraid of what would happen if it came out." Everyone turned to her, including him. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. But there was weight in her every syllable, a weight that had clearly been carried for too long. "I thought protecting the story would protect us," she went on. "But I realize now it only protected one person. And it wasn't you," she said, glancing at me. My father took a step back. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the first moment his body betrayed what he'd been holding in. Then, just like that, he swayed. No dramatics, no gasps. He simply leaned too far back without meaning to, and his body folded. My brother caught him halfway down, and the chair clattered behind them as they both hit the floor. My mother rushed over, calling his name over and over, her voice finally shaking. "Call someone," she said to no one in particular. "Call someone now." The room erupted into motion. Chairs scraped. Footsteps scrambled toward phones. I could hear my sister's voice in the hallway, already dialing for help. Everything was sound and flurry. Except me. I didn't move. I watched, not with coldness, not with victory, but with a stillness I didn't know I had in me. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being asked to fix something. I wasn't the one smoothing things over. I wasn't the one swallowing truth so someone else could breathe easier. That role, whatever it had been, was done. I looked at the scattered pages on the table. I didn't touch them, didn't need to. They had spoken louder than anything I'd ever managed to say in 3 decades. And as the EMTs arrived, as my brother waved them in from the porch, as my mother murmured something over my father's now stabilizing form, I stayed seated. I had nothing more to prove. The truth had done what I never could. It ended the silence and left us with what came after. Mutsain. Later that night, the house fell strangely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that invites peace, but the kind that hums with everything that's just been said or revealed. The lights from the ambulance had long faded down the street. The front door had clicked shut after the last pair of shoes stepped out, and what was left behind wasn't debris, but a weight in the air. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after everyone had gone to bed. The report still sat in the middle of the dining room, a corner of one page curling upward like it too, was exhausted. No one had touched it again after the paramedics arrived, not even my father, once he regained some color in his face and a bit of his pride. He said nothing as they helped him to his feet. Not to them, not to me, and no one apologized. Not that night, not in the hours that followed, and certainly not in the days after. I think that's when I finally understood. I'd spent too many years holding out for something they weren't capable of giving, for acknowledgement, for regret, for some gesture of clarity that would tell me I wasn't crazy for remembering things the way I did. But I didn't need it anymore. Waiting for it would have been its own kind of prison. It wouldn't heal anything. It would only keep the wound fresh. So I let it go. Not out of grace, not even forgiveness, just out of sheer exhaustion. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from my mother in the living room. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, dust catching in the glow. She held a cup of tea with both hands, not drinking it, just holding it like a habit. The TV was on, but muted. Some old sitcom running reruns, canned laughter playing silently while the tension in the room filled every corner. "I don't expect you to understand," she said, eyes fixed on the window instead of me. "I don't," I answered quietly. "But I think I understand why you didn't say anything." She nodded. "It was safer back then." I didn't argue. Her silence had protected her. But I wasn't a child anymore, and protecting her silence had nearly cost me everything. So I let her keep her reasons. But I didn't take them on as mine. That was the difference now. I didn't carry things that didn't belong to me anymore. That same afternoon, my brother passed me in the hallway. We both paused, awkward, like strangers who vaguely recognized each other. He looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe explain why he hadn't stood up for me. Maybe not. I didn't ask. I realized I didn't need his side of the story either. Because I wasn't in competition anymore. Not for approval, not for love, not for whatever scraps of identity I used to think were up for grabs. He was who he was. A product of the same roof. Just wired to survive it differently. And that was enough. 3 evenings later, I was back in my small apartment, dim, familiar. My place had never looked cleaner. Maybe it was just the contrast to the last few days. Or maybe I'd stopped seeing it as temporary. That night, I pulled the cover off the upright piano tucked against the wall. I hadn't touched it in weeks. The middle C had always sounded off, not quite flat, not quite sharp, just enough to grate on anyone else's ear. But I'd gotten used to it, grown up with it, really. Still, I reached inside and adjusted the hammer, gently tapping it back into place. Then I sat down, placed my fingers on the keys, and played something quiet. Not to remember, not to prove, just to feel the sound fill the room without anyone judging whether it was worth hearing. It wasn't broken. It just wasn't tuned for their ears. And that, too, was no longer my problem. I didn't leave that house on Father's Day with any apology tucked into my pocket. I didn't get closure or forgiveness or some neat bow tied around the mess we called a family. But I kept something. I kept my integrity. I kept the truth. I kept the version of me that had stopped apologizing for making other people uncomfortable with facts. And maybe most importantly, I let go of the role I never asked for, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the one who stays small so others can stay comfortable. That job had never come with a paycheck, just guilt. Now I understood. I didn't owe anyone my silence, not anymore. I looked at the closed envelope sitting on the shelf by the door, creased but intact. I never threw it out. I never waved it around, either. I just let it be, like me. Some stories don't end in reunions. Some end with a man playing a quiet song in a quiet room, knowing finally. I didn't walk away with their approval. I walked away with myself. And that was finally enough.